as we can. And UAW Local 600 and other UAW locals are starting to recognize that if they want to build community support for a broadened labor movement, you do that by engaging in the kinds of issues that are important and imperative for the community. So this was a rally we had last year on behalf of raising money for people before banks. This is more recent, and this is what's, I think, especially encouraging, is that the Occupy movement and the labor movement, or at least portions of the labor movement that recognize where a potential future might lie, are starting to join together. This was a couple in Southgate. They're not members of the UAW, and yet look at this headline: UAW members join march to bank on couple's behalf. She had a stroke. That was her crime. That's why she's going to be thrown out of her house. She had a stroke and could no longer earn enough income along with her husband's income as an auto mechanic to pay the mortgage that Bank of America held on this house. And they would not modify. Bank of America would not modify. Why? Because the mortgage is guaranteed by Fannie Mae, the Federal National Mortgage Association, which is now government owned. It went into bankruptcy, or nearly so, in 2008. It was taken over by the federal government. We picketed the bank. Again, we got enormous amounts of media coverage. The UAW provided most of the pickets from Local 600, Local 387, Local 372, Local 3000. This is something we've been working on for a couple of years, and it's starting to pay off. It's very exciting. It needs to be obviously amplified. But here again, it looks like a positive outcome. The bank, after months of stonewalling and then finally selling the mortgage to Fannie Mae, they got full value, by the way. One reason they don't want to modify is they can sell the mortgage to Fannie Mae and get the full value of what's owed on the mortgage. Why would they then modify the mortgage and take a lower payment when they can sell it, taxpayer money again, through Fannie Mae, now owned by the federal government? It's an outrage. Our taxpayer dollars are evicting people. And there's a lot of folks in the UAW who can tap into the outrage and anger over that and recognize that if they can help people like the Henrys, that's the name of this couple, they also are helping their prospects in the future, because what we want is the labor movement to again become a symbol of social justice and not a symbol of a separate and special interest. Because if you're only representing the people in your bargaining unit, you are a special interest. If you're representing workers in general, you have a prospect for widening the social base for the labor movement. Anybody recognize this?
Unionist.
Unionist, that's right. And here again, a lot of unions joined in support of this, and it was great for those of us who have been around for a long while. I really enjoyed coming to a demonstration where when me and my wife would show up, the average age would spike upward by about 15 years. And here again, I don't know where this leads, but if the labor movement is to reestablish itself as a focal point of social justice, it has to be engaging in these kinds of support actions, including one, by the way, where a bunch of us, UAW Region 1A, about 60 of us went into the restaurant at noon and basically blocked the door for a while. The police showed up, ordered us to leave. As we came out, stopped for a prayer meeting. The police aren't going to break up a prayer meeting. So actually for about 45 minutes we disrupted their lunch break. And finally Andiamo saw the light and was compelled, really pressured, to make a settlement with ROC in this particular case. SEIU has recognized this for many years. Service Employees International Union. You can no longer organize janitors as employees of the building where they clean, because now increasingly it's contractors, and if you organize the contractor, the company just says, well, the hell with you, we'll go find a non-union contractor. What that means is that if you're going to organize janitors, you have to organize the entire labor market of that city so that everyone recognizes the need and the compelling need to organize around justice for janitors, respect for janitors. And they've had enormous success over the last 10 years on that basis. For them, it's the idea of social unionism, in other words, of engaging the community and being part of that community, is a matter of stone survival, given the occupational changes we've been looking at. I'm almost done, by the way. I love this photo. This was the march in Detroit, and I think captures what we're trying to convey. There is one of the oddest, outsourced to Detroit. Never thought I'd see that on the side of a building downtown. What else do we have? Oh yes, this is one of my favorites. This is the last shot. This again is Grand Circus Park, and I really like this. What did you do in the class war, Daddy? And Mommy. But it's now a way of phrasing what's going on that would not have been imaginable just a few years ago. You can actually now talk about social class and inequality and wealth. Even Republicans are attacking each other over private equity banking, if you've been following what's going on in South Carolina. That's how prominent the issue has become, and it's an opportunity for the labor movement to rethink its mission, broaden its base, and reestablish itself as a vanguard of labor rather than the aristocracy of labor. That's the presentation.
So we're supposed to end at 12:30. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve. We've got about 8 minutes or so, and so I think you can field your own questions.
Okay. By the way, I also want to get, many of you may know this, this is the 1515 Broadway, which is where the Occupy movement has been basically concentrating its meetings and activity during the winter months. It's now threatened with eviction by Citicorp, and I think we've got the grounds for actually persuading them that that's not a good idea unless they want actually the TV cameras filming folks being carried out of 1515 and the police ejecting folks. I think we've got a chance of winning this. If you want to take a look at this and join us on Thursday, there's going to be a great social event and political event at 1550. We've got flyers up here. Actually, why don't I just pass these back? And you got a hand up.
I'm interested in how much of a rhyme you think there is between the sort of Henry Ford capitalist era association with fascism and our moment.
It doesn't rhyme as much as you might think. Obviously, though, the question of democracy versus authoritarianism of various sorts, the word fascism is way too loaded to be effectively used, I think, in the present. It does refer to a very specific kind of social movement of the 1930s and 40s in Germany and Italy. And it's kind of the F-bomb when you throw it in any kind of current circumstance. But I do think we need to talk about the difference between this is what democracy looks like, a chant we often use, and the alternative is a wide range of authoritarian and top-down and corporate-driven alternatives that don't look like the fascism of the 30s and 40s. It's not the jackboot sort, although it can become that. And frankly, the further you move from our shores and the more you move into a lot of the parts of the global economy, it can start to look very much that way. So I think we have to find a way of understanding that what we're talking about is a real threat to democracy, but it's more of an administrative and top-down, potentially backed by the police, but more often it's going to take the form, for example, as it has here in Michigan, of the emergency manager law. And there again, what they're talking about is nullifying our voting rights and implementing a solution that's focused exclusively, not exclusively, but largely on protecting the interests of the banks in this particular circumstance. Because remember that Detroit actually pays about $650 to $700 million a year servicing the bank loans that have been used over the past few years to shore up the deficit. Where does the deficit come from? The deficit comes from the depopulation of Detroit. And where does that depopulation come from? And the resulting reduction in tax base? It comes from foreclosures and evictions, and it comes from capital flight to all parts of the globe. And foreclosures and evictions is part of what the banks did to trash our economy. And the emergency manager is basically forcing the solution onto the backs of working people so that the city can keep paying the full debt. No write-down of the debt. And I find actually Europe kind of interesting because they're now starting to actually recognize that they might have to write down the debt owed by many of these countries because there's no other way of effectively resolving that solution. I'd like to see the same thing talked about in the case of Detroit. We need to talk about a solution that doesn't put the entire burden of it on working people who are innocent of the decisions that have trashed our economy. That's the best I can do for you.
When you say write down a debt, what do you mean?
Say what again?
When you say write down a debt.
I mean the same thing as modifying a loan when you talk about reduction in principal. If you bought a house for $150,000 and it's now worth $40,000, the bank needs to write down the amount owed, maybe not all the way down to 40,000, but it has to substantially reduce the principal owed, because what happened was the banks misrepresented what was going on in the economy. Many people were encouraged to refinance their homes or buy a home on the presumption it would never go down in value. You could always sell off your home and pay off the remaining principal. That turned out not to be the case, and it was the banks who sold it that way. So there needs to be a reduction in debt along those lines. A recognition that if they're going to get paid back at all in an equitable manner, they have to actually reduce the amount that they expect to get. Here and then there.
Henry Ford is connected to Nazi Germany. Why isn't Hank Paulson, Goldman Sachs, connected to Communist China?
That's a very interesting point. I could go a step further and say, what's the difference between Robert Rubin and Hank Paulson, except that one was an advisor to a Democratic president, and the other was an advisor to a Republican president. I mean, I'm active in the Democratic Party, but it's not out of any presumption that they represent an automatic and effective alternative. The point you're making is a very interesting one, because and it speaks to your point, which is that Goldman Sachs and the rest of the investment class in the United States sees nothing wrong with an authoritarian government in which independent unions are illegal and there are no elections. That's China. It's their wet dream of what an economy might look like. So again, but it's an authoritarianism that's common to both.